For weeks it looked like nothing. A shuttered seaside boarding house on a sandbar, paint peeling, shutters closed. One more dead vacation property on a coast the war emptied out years ago. Then in early August 2026, Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces said what it actually was. A working base for Russia's FSB security service, sitting quietly behind the front on the Arabat Spit. Reconnaissance drones had been building the picture for weeks. What finally gave the place away wasn't a soldier, it was the traffic. The place has a name. Locals called the complex Benya House, a boarding house resort in the village of Shchaslyvtseve. If you have never heard of Shchaslyvtseve, that is exactly the point. It sits on the Arabat Spit, a long, thin ribbon of sand and salt grass that runs down the southern edge of Kherson Oblast, water on both sides. To the east, the Sea of Azov. To the west, the Sivash, a shallow, briny lagoon locals call the Rotten Sea. In places, the whole spit is barely a few hundred meters wide. There is one road. There is nowhere to hide a convoy and nowhere for a convoy to run. Before the full-scale invasion, this was a holiday coast. Cheap sanatoriums, summer rentals, families from Kherson and Kharkiv driving down for 2 weeks of flat, warm water. After February 2022, Russian forces occupied the spit as part of the land corridor stitching mainland Russia to Crimea. The tourists left. The boarding houses stayed empty, their signboards fading in the salt air. And somewhere in that emptiness, Russia's security service decided a shuttered resort was the perfect place to put people it did not want anyone to find. That is the logic worth pausing on. The FSB is not the regular army. It runs counterintelligence, internal security, filtration of the occupied population, and the quiet machinery of holding stolen ground. A base like that does not want to sit next to a tank park where every satellite pass counts the vehicles. It wants to look boring. A closed vacation property on a sand spit 200 kilometers behind the shooting is about as boring as real estate gets. On a map, it is nothing. That was supposed to be the protection. The unit that took it apart works under Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces, the branch built specifically to run drones as a service of its own, commanded by Robert Brovdy, the officer better known by his call sign Madyar. The strike itself was carried out by fighters of the 9th Battalion, call sign Kairos, part of the 414th Separate Brigade, working jointly with Ukraine's military intelligence, the HER. That pairing matters. Military intelligence does the patient work of figuring out what a building actually is. The drone brigade does the part where the building stops existing. And here is the first thing to hold on to because it reframes the whole video. This was not one lucky shot at one odd target. Benya House was a single entry in a 48-hour operational push that, by Ukraine's own count, put unmanned systems onto 102 targets across the occupied south and the seas around it. Ships, substations, ammunition, fuel, radars, air defense. The FSB resort was the marquee name inside that window, the one with a story attached. But it was one node in a machine that has been running all summer, and it helps to understand the machine before we get to the house. Start with the geography of the problem, because geography is the whole reason a place like this exists. Russia holds a strip of southern Ukraine that runs from the Zaporizhia front down across the Kherson steppe and into Crimea. Everything Russia does on that ground, and everything it ships toward Crimea, depends on rear areas that used to be genuinely safe. 2 years ago, a target 200 kilometers behind the line was a target you did not worry about, because Ukraine could not reach it cheaply or often. That assumption is now dead, and the Arabat Spit is one of the places it died. The tool that killed it is the long-range strike drone, not the small quadcopter you have seen tipping into a trench, the one with a few kilometers of range and a battery that dies in the cold. The rear areas are hunted by a different class of machine, fixed-wing engine-driven, built to fly deep, the kind of one-way attack drone that measures its reach in the tens and hundreds of kilometers. Ukraine has never confirmed which specific platform hit Benya House, and we are not going to pretend otherwise. But given that the target sat well behind occupied territory, it belongs to that deep strike family, not to the frontline quadcopter world. That distinction is the difference between a target that can be reached and a target that cannot. Now put the two together. A shuttered resort that looks like nothing, and a drone force that can reach 200 kilometers into occupied ground for the price of a used car. The only thing standing between them is knowledge. Russia's whole bet was that nobody would ever know what Benya House was. To beat that bet, Ukraine did not need a bigger warhead. It needed to watch, so it watched. And that is where the story slows down, because the interesting part of this strike is not the impact. It is the weeks before it. Reconnaissance drones are not glamorous. They fly high, they loiter, they stare, and mostly they record a lot of nothing. Over a coastal village that Russia had written off as empty, a lot of nothing is exactly what you would expect. Closed buildings, empty car parks, wind moving the grass. The skill is in noticing the moment the nothing stops being nothing. According to Ukrainian accounts of the operation, that is precisely what happened over Benya House. The picture built slowly, detail by detail, the way real intelligence usually does rather than in a single dramatic reveal. A closed boarding house does not need vehicles coming and going. This one had them. A closed boarding house does not need power. Empty buildings sit dark. Watchers reported the signs of generators keeping a shuttered resort running through the night, which is a strange thing for a place with no guests. And a closed boarding house has no reason to carry communications gear, the antennas and links that a working command node cannot live without. None of those things is proof on its own. A generator could be anything. A car could be anyone. But intelligence is not built from single facts. It is built from a pattern that only fits one explanation. A dead resort that quietly draws power, moves vehicles on a schedule, and talks to the outside world is not a dead resort. It is something wearing a dead resort as a costume. Peel those layers back one at a time and the honest conclusion arrives on its own. People are living and working here, and they are going to great lengths to make sure it does not look that way. That is the moment the target changes character. Up to then, Benya House is a question mark, a building that behaves oddly. Once military intelligence assessed it as an FSB personnel node, it became something else. A fixed, known, high-value point on the map, with a name, a function, and a set of people whose entire job depended on nobody drawing that exact conclusion. Weeks of patient watching turned an empty coastline into a coordinate. The drone was almost the easy part. Finding out what to aim it at was the hard part, and it was already done. Here is the open loop to carry forward because it decides everything that follows. On the Arabat Spit, there is nowhere to hide and nowhere to run. One road, water on both sides. Once Ukraine knew what the building was, the people inside it were living in the least escapable real estate in southern Ukraine, and they did not know it yet. Hold that thought. We will come back to what that geography meant at the moment of the strike. Step back to the campaign for a moment, because Benya House does not make sense in isolation. Through the summer of 2026, Ukraine's drone forces ran a sustained effort against the machinery that keeps the occupied south alive and against the wider Russian rear. One strand of it has a nickname, the Crimean Switch Off, a running campaign against the power network feeding occupied territory. By Ukraine's accounting, that effort had struck on the order of 211 energy nodes since the 1st of July alone, substations and transformer yards across occupied Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, and Luhansk. You do not read about most of them. Each one is a village going dark, a pumping station stopping, a radar losing its clean feed of power. Individually small. Together, a slow strangling of the grid that runs the occupation. The 48-tower window that contained the Benya House strike was one hard pulse inside that longer campaign. Ukraine's own figures for those 2 days describe unmanned systems reaching 102 separate targets. Among them, Ukraine claims, were around 10 power substations, plus ammunition and fuel depots, radar complexes, Buk air defense systems, and rail and communications targets. It is important to be honest about what that number is. It is a Ukrainian operational claim put out by the Unmanned Systems Forces and its commander, not an independently audited scoreboard. Treat it as what one side says its own machine did in 2 days. Even discounted, the shape of it is clear. This is not a handful of spectacular one-offs. It is industrial. It is a production line pointed at the enemy's rear. And that is why a single shuttered resort earns 20 minutes. Benya House is the human face of an otherwise faceless campaign. Substations and depots are abstractions. An FSB base hidden in a holiday boarding house is a story you can see. It tells you in one concrete building exactly what the whole summer's work has been doing. Finding the things Russia thought it had hidden behind distance and boredom, and reaching them anyway. There is one more claim from that same window worth putting on the table, with the same caution. Ukraine says the 2-day push also struck 6 vessels of Russia's so-called shadow fleet in the Black and Azov Seas, described as 2 tankers and 4 cargo ships. The Shadow Fleet is the collection of aging, often opaquely owned vessels Russia uses to move oil and cargo around sanctions. 6 hulls in 2 days is a large claim, and again, it is Ukraine's claim. One-sided and not independently confirmed here. We flag it as a claim and move on. But it belongs in the frame because it shows the reach. The same operational window that touched a resort on a sandbar also, by Ukraine's account, reached out onto open water. Rear bases, the grid, and the sea logistics, all inside the same 2 days. Now come back to the Spit because the reconnaissance is done and the coordinate is set. This is the part where the patient work turns into 90 seconds of flight. We cannot narrate the strike minute by minute the way a cockpit recording would, and we are not going to invent one. What the drone was, exactly, has not been confirmed. What the defenders inside did in their final minutes was not filmed for the public. Casualty figures for the Benya House strike have not been reported at all, and this channel is not going to make up a body count to fill the silence. What can be said is what the geography and the class of weapon make almost certain, and it is enough. A deep strike drone does not scream in from the front line. It arrives from the direction and altitude Russian air defense on the Spit is least ready for. Having flown a long, quiet route over occupied ground, or over water to get there. On a sand ribbon a few hundred meters wide, there is no clutter to lose it in, no city, no forest, no ridge. There is a road, a line of buildings, the flat shine of the Azov on one side and the dead flat of the Sivash on the other. Against that emptiness, one specific boarding house had been turned into the only thing that mattered. Everything around it was decoration. For the people inside, the first real warning would have been almost no warning at all. That is the nature of a one-way attack drone against a fixed target that does not know it has been found. There is no siren for a building that officially does not exist. There is no scramble for a base that has spent weeks pretending to be empty, because pretending to be empty means you cannot suddenly light up with activity without confirming exactly what you are. The disguise that hid Benya House for weeks was also a cage. To stay hidden, it had to stay quiet. Staying quiet meant it could not react. The costume did not just fail at the end, it made failing worse. The impact ended the argument about what the building was. A structure that had been carefully maintained as a fiction became, in an instant, a fact. Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces reported the FSB base at Benya House struck, and the site destroyed or damaged, credited to the 9th Battalion Kairos of the 414th Brigade together with military intelligence. That is the confirmed core, and we will hold the line at what is confirmed. No cinematic secondary explosions we cannot source. No antenna farm shattering in slow motion. No count of the men inside. Just this. The disguise came off permanently, and the site went from working node to wreckage. Think about what actually died there, though, because it is not the building. A boarding house is cheap. What is expensive is what the FSB puts inside one. The officers who run counterintelligence and population control for a stretch of occupied coast, the communications that tie them to their chain, the quiet routine of a security service holding ground it stole. A resort can be rebuilt in a season. The specialized people and the trust that the place was safe cannot be replaced by lunchtime. The most valuable thing Benya House lost was the thing that made it useful in the first place, the certainty that nobody knew it was there. Remember the open loop from earlier, the one about the road and the water? Here is where it pays off. The Arabat Spit was chosen by Russia as a hiding place precisely because it is remote, thin, and unimportant. Every quality that made it a good place to hide is a quality that makes it a terrible place to be found. There is no depth to disperse into. There is no second position to fall back to that isn't just another exposed point on the same one road. The remoteness that felt like protection was only ever protection against being noticed. Once Ukraine noticed, the remoteness flipped. It stopped being a wall around the FSB and became a wall around a target with nowhere to go. That is the lesson of Benya House, and it is bigger than one building. For most of this war, Russia's rear areas have been protected by a simple idea, too far to reach, too dull to find. Both halves of that idea are failing at once. The drones can reach further and cheaper every month. The intelligence to find hidden nodes is getting patient and good. Put those together and the old safe distance stops being safe. A shuttered resort 200 kilometers behind the front is exactly the kind of place that used to be untouchable, and it wasn't. Now widen the lens back out to the 40A tower window. because the aftermath of Benya House is not just one wrecked building. It is what that building represents inside the larger tally. In those 2 days, by Ukraine's account, the same drone force that reached the resort also struck around 10 substations, hit ammunition and fuel storage, damaged radar complexes and Buk air defense systems, and went after rail and communications links, 102 targets in all. Fold Benya House into that and its real meaning appears. It was not the war-winning blow. It was proof of coverage. Proof that the same eyes and the same reach that can dim a city's grid or crater a fuel dump can also find one hidden security node on a sandbar and close it. And the Crimean switch-off keeps grinding underneath all of it. Around 211 energy nodes struck since the 1st of July by Ukraine's count. Each one is small. The cumulative effect is not. A grid that is patched and repatched week after week, substations that come back online and get hit again, radars that keep losing clean power, a population under occupation living with the lights flickering as a constant reminder that the rear is no longer a rear. That is the strategic frame Benya House sits inside. Not a single knockout. A steady industrial erosion of everything that makes holding the occupied South comfortable. There is a temptation, watching a strike like this, to reach for the human drama of the losing side. We are not going to. The men working an FSB base on occupied Ukrainian ground were not lost tourists caught in a summer storm. They were part of the apparatus running an occupation, on soil that a security service had no business being on, in a country their state chose to invade. The strike removed a functioning node of that apparatus. That is the whole story of the casualties, and it is enough of one. What matters going forward is the pattern, and the pattern is the through line of this entire campaign. Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces, the 414th Brigade and its Kairos Battalion working with military intelligence, are methodically rolling up the hidden furniture of the Russian rear. Resort house command posts, power substations, fuel and ammunition dumps, radars and air defense batteries. Shadow fleet hulls out on the Azov and the Black Sea, by Ukraine's own claim. Different targets, same idea. Find the thing Russia thought was safe because it was far away or disguised as something dull and reach it. Benya House is the clean example, the one you can point at. A security service took an empty holiday boarding house on a strip of sand and turned it into a base, betting everything on the idea that a place this boring would never be looked at closely. Ukrainian drones looked at it closely for weeks. Then they took the bet away. Russia hid a piece of its occupation inside a shuttered seaside resort and called it safe. The drones found the resort, the disguise, and the reason it was chosen, and turned all three into rubble on a sandbar between two seas. The old safe distance is gone. On the Arabat Spit, there was one road in and no road out.